So this event this afternoon is a joint event between the Centre for Catholic Studies and the Catholic Archives Society of the UK. And we've got representatives from both of those bodies here today. And for those of you who came to something we did a few months ago, this is, if you like, the follow-on one, and perhaps the flip side of it. So the first session we did was called Hidden Histories, and it was about the uses that historians oh, sorry, a second. We'll just wait a second just for that screen share shop. There we go. And that workshop was about how historians can make use of archives, and particularly religious archives, and particularly those to do with religious orders, and the wealth of material they have there. But this time we want to flip it and look instead from the viewpoint of archive practitioners. And we want to look at the current ways that items and archives are being preserved, and possible future ways as well. So what I would just say as well as part of that we, both the Catholic Archive Society and the Centre for Catholic Studies and Durham University, are always happy to talk to people who want to talk about their archives and to ask for advice. And to just reiterate that, that's not just me saying that, that's a genuine thing, that we are happy to hear from you to talk about them. So saying that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Judith Smeaton, who is a former chair of the Catholic Archive Society and its founder, and one of its founder members as well, and has been heavily involved in a lot of discussions about the future of Catholic archives, certainly in England and Wales. And so, Judith, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for the introduction, and thank you to you and all your colleagues at CCS who've made today possible. And also thanks to everybody who's opted to come and listen to us. As James said, I was a founder member of the Catholic Archives Society, which I'll probably refer to as CS going on. And so it's fallen to me to give a brief introduction to archives, Catholic Archives and the Catholic Archives Society, because there'll be some of you out there who perhaps don't have a full background on all of those things. So starting off about archives, what are archives? Archives are for life and for living. They are not about getting lost in the past, but for understanding the present. Now that's a quote from the website of the International Council on Archives, which I commend to any of you who want a bit more information. It certainly gets away from the old stereotype of archives as a collection of dusty papers in a basement, only ever disturbed by some deranged academic looking for some obscure piece of information. But more specifically, archives are the documentary byproduct of human activity, retained for their value, their long-term value, practical, administrative, historical, possibly spiritual, usually by the people and organizations that create them as they go about their business. They come in a variety of formats: written, photographic, moving image, sound, analog, digital, whatever. And also definitions may vary between current records, things being created and used at the moment, or archives, the historical material. But in one sense, archives are always current, even if the business has ceased to exist. For example, in the case of a religious community which has come to completion, the archives of any organization like that continue to provide a sort of window on the past, and they continue to inform the present and inspire the future. In terms of church archives, tradition has always played a very significant part in the life of the church, from the time of the apostles onwards, recording events in the life of the church, passing on the stories, passing on the tradition, has always been very important and continued from generation to generation. In Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis reminds us about the importance of memory. The joy of evangelizing always arises from grateful remembrance. It is a grace which we constantly need to implore. The apostles never forgot the moment when Jesus touched their hearts. Together with Jesus, this remembrance makes present to us a great cloud of witnesses, some of whom, as believers, we recall with great joy. Remember your leaders who spoke to you of the word of God. Some of them were ordinary people who were close to us, and introduced us to the faith. The believer is essentially one who remembers. Now, there isn't time to explore the theology of archives, you'll be relieved to know. I leave that for a theologian and another day. But thinking about the role of archives in the life of the church, we need to know what teachings this is based on. The Second Vatican Council, which brought about renewal in the life of the church, produced several documents which revived the interest in archives and underlined their importance. And I'm just going to mention three specifically. Dei Verbum, which is the dogmatic constitution on the church, the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation, reinforced the importance of tradition and developed a dynamic theology of tradition. One little quote: what was handed on by the apostles includes everything which contributes to the holiness of life and the increase of faith in the people of God. And so the church, in her teaching, life and worship, perpetuates and hands on to all the generations, all that she herself is, all that she believes. Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, devoted a whole chapter to the proper development of culture, which I think was rather a new concept to the church at the time. It recognized the vital role that culture plays in people's lives and stressed the importance of culture in preaching the gospel. And this became the foundation for the key text concerning archives in the church, the circular letter, the pastoral function of church archives, of which more in a little bit. And finally, I'd mention Perfecti Caritas, the decree on the renewal of religious life, which called for a continuous return to the sources of Christian life and to the original inspiration behind a given community. This caused communities to go back to their roots and to revisit the charisms of their founders, which also caused them to revisit their archives, some of which had not received a great deal of attention over years, if not centuries. And this in turn led to the foundation of Catholic Archive Society as a response to people asking for help who'd been tasked with looking after the archives but had no experience or training in doing that. So the founder members of Catholic Archive Society, which began in 1979, were primarily archivists of religious communities, members of communities, and diocesan archivists, with some professional archivists and librarians. And our membership today is still very similar. And significantly, the aims of the society today are still the same as they were then, primarily to promote the care and preservation of the archives of all dioceses, religious foundations, institutions, and societies of the Roman Catholic Church in the United Kingdom and Ireland. I should just say that the Association of Church Archives in Ireland didn't exist at that time. And the society sought to attain those objectives by promoting the identification and listing of archives, by providing Catholic archivists with informational, technical advice, training, by organising conferences and seminars, and by publishing a journal, a newsletter, and occasional publications. All of those activities continue because not only is the work of an archivist never done because new archives are always being created, but new ways of working are developed. So new skills have to be learned, how to deal with digital archives, for example. And also because new people come to the work of looking after Catholic archives and need some introduction to that world. Unlike many of our founder members, a lot of these new people have training and experience, but not in Catholic archives, because many church organizations are employing people, professional people, who have these qualifications, but they don't always have the background. And so, as John McCafferty said earlier in one of the hidden history sessions, which James mentioned, both archivists and historians need to be familiar with the specialist language of the church in order to interpret the archives. And so CAS is able to support these these new members, and they find great benefit from meeting together, talking to each other about topical issues in the context specifically of Catholic archives. And if anybody wants to know more, there's a lot on the Catholic Archives Society website. I think CS is unique, certainly here in England and Wales, and being founded by and for archivists and custodians of Catholic archives, whereas some other church archive groups are really founded by academics, historians, and other professional people, so that the emphasis in CS has always been on the needs of the custodians of the archives, whilst recognising the value of Catholic archives to the whole community. So the charisms of individual communities, their administrative structures of the organisations, and the role of the archives within these organisations is always recognised. And within that context, CS tries to bring professional training and standards and encourages Catholic archivists to adopt the best practices of archive keeping employed in civil archives and to implement the requirements of civil law. Archivists must and do engage, for example, with issues relating to both access and closure, in relating to members of their own communities and organisations, scholars and the wider public, including, for example, the implementation of legislation on freedom of information and data protection. The publication of the Pastoral Function of Church Archives in 1997, almost 20 years after the foundation of the Society, gave us a great boost and encouragement, because it did set out very clearly why and how church archives should be kept, why they were so important. So it's become our handbook, the Bible, you might say, even for anyone involved in the care and preservation of church archives. Now, the whole document is very valuable. We've only got a short amount of time, so just a few points. This document was a circular letter from the Pontifical Commission for the Cultural Heritage of the Church, and you can find the text again on the Vatican website. In the introduction, Archbishop, later Cardinal Marquesano, who was president of the commission, wrote, "Archives are places of memory of the church, of the Christian community, and storehouses of culture for the new evangelization." He also pointed out that John Paul II desired that the cultural heritage of the church be given due attention, since it stands as a witness to the Christian tradition and represents a means to carry out the work of new evangelization required today. So the first section of the letter is all about the importance of the transmission of documents. It's all quite inspirational. I could quote the whole thing, but the important key, I think, is the quote from Pope Paul VI's comment that the church, in church archives are kept the traces of the transitus domini in human history. The letter goes on to explain that knowledge of the past creates a sense of continuity and becomes a tool for pastoral action. Sections 2 and 3 provide the concrete plan. They build on the provisions of the 1983 Code of Canon Law to provide a detailed framework for the collection, administration, conservation, and use of archives, and provide guidelines, including the need to employ qualified personnel and up-to-date methods, as well as urging cooperation with civil bodies and societies. Section 4 returns to the importance of church archives in the historical culture and mission of the church. This is important because it stresses that archives are not exclusively for the use of the church, but should be available to all who want to know about the history of Christian people and the communities where Christians lived and worked. In time, the archives become the heritage of all humanity. Working with other organisations, cultural bodies, and so on, is part of the pastoral work of the church. I began with what are archives, so I conclude with what is an archivist. Returning to the website of the International Council on Archives, we find archivist as custodian of society's memory, which fits well with the definition of archives of places of memory of the Christian community. I've touched on their many and varied tasks, which the following speakers will expand on. Some of you will point out that archivists, as well as being called to collect archives, are also called sometimes to be chroniclers as well. Cardinal Casaroli is quoted in the Pastoral Function of Church Archives, describing archivists, on account of their service to the church and to scholars, as artisans of peace and unity among men. I couldn't resist that quote, and if we had time, we could discuss what exactly it means and whether it's true. But service, whether or not specifically identified, is at the core of the profession. Service to the archives, service to the church, to history, to culture, and to evangelization. Church archivists might then regard the profession as a vocation and their work as a ministry within the church. Agreeing with David Bracken, who, speaking to a Catholic Archives Society conference in 2019, said, "As ministers of memory and hope, church archivists have a central role to play in the church as an evangelical project, inviting our communities to rediscover their roots as a resource for the road ahead." Thank you. And please do contact the Catholic Archives Society if you want to know anything about Catholic archives.
Thank you very much for that, Judith, and bringing yourself dead in on time, which is always a great source of happiness for me. But also thank you for giving us the impetus, if you like, behind the event, but also the background to the, if you like, the special elements that are required for dealing with Catholic archives and Catholic collections. And it will lead us in neatly now to some of those initiatives and some of those people also working directly on them. So the first, if you like, trio I'm going to introduce are going to do a joint one together, all from Durham University's Special Collections team. And it is Michael Stansfield, Tony King, and Jonathan Bush, who are going to talk about what has been happening within the university's collection. So I'll hand over to you, Sri.
Thank you very much indeed, James. If I just get this. Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this snapshot of Durham University Library's Catholic collections. I'm Michael Stansfield. I'm an archivist, what Judith has been talking about, and I will say a few words about ourselves, why we have what we have, and also what we actually have. Then my conservator colleague, Tony King, will explain something about how we look after what we have. And then my archivist colleague, Jonathan Bush, will explain some of what goes on to make those collections accessible for research, which is what we are principally about. As being a research-led university, we take this material in with a view to facilitating the exploration of the stories that these collections contain, be they great, such as what they might tell us about wider church movements, or small, such as perhaps the role of someone's family antecedent in that movement. Anyway, we are located at Palace Green Library in the centre of Durham, between its cathedral and castle, with a frontage on the right here, including Bishop John Cousin's innovative 17th century library and the university's first lecture rooms of the 19th century, and a rear aspect on the left, including the unique medieval Palatinate administrative building of the Bishops of Durham. Inside, our facilities include an up-to-date search room and conservation studio, and lots of racking for all the books, documents, maps, photos, tapes, videos, objects, etc. that we look after. We also look after the cathedral's archive collections at another building on the far side of the cathedral from Palace Green. Furthermore, for the last 10 years or so, we have also been looking after the book and archive collections at Ushaw College, with its library building being seen on the right-hand side in both these images. For those who are not aware, the college was established at Ushaw in 1808, What had been a growing relationship with the University at Durham was formalized in 1968, with Ushaw becoming one of its halls of residence. The University Library's particular association with the college's collections and that growth into wider interest in Catholic collections stems perhaps from two subsequent developments. Firstly, which our chair, James Kelly, may be able to comment on better than myself, was the establishment of the Centre for Catholic Studies and the thereby developing academic interest in all things Catholic. Secondly, there was the closure of the college as a seminary and the university's subsequent involvement in helping to look after the collections at the college and upgrading their cataloguing to facilitate remote access to that information. This was a positive development to come out of the college's closure, which, through the mounting of such catalogue data on the university's website, has enabled researchers anywhere to discover the great riches of the college's collections. This growing accessibility, and one should also acknowledge the role of the Residential Research Library Fellowships scheme here, has facilitated research and has also encouraged other Catholic organisations and individuals to consider whether their collections could be part of this story. This, in essence, is continuing a trend that has long been a feature of the collections at Ushaw, as they have included for some time much material from elsewhere, such as papers of local Catholic figures and families, and significant Catholic parish library collections, and most substantially the library and archive of the former English College in Lisbon. And perhaps I might just mention here the particular role and life's work of Father Michael Sharrett, whose Requiem Mass has literally only just concluded. And I'm delighted to see that it has concluded, because that means my colleague Jonathan Bush is here in this developing of the collections in all respects of that. Anyway, since the university's direct involvement, this accretion has developed in perhaps two particular areas. Catholic lay organizations and female religious orders. A number have been looking for homes for their collections as their missions have come to completion. And, sorry, lost that for a moment. As their missions have come to completion and their collections have been readied for the next stage of their existence, moving from working administrative collections to research resources for academics and others to explore what those collections might have to say about those missions. The collections are significant in themselves, and my colleague Jonathan will explore some of the particular riches of one of them shortly. But they also add up to produce a corpus of material whose sum is greater, I would suggest, even than its individual parts. And when you put this Catholic material alongside the major Anglican collections that we also hold, for such as the Diocese of Cathedral of Durham, and also such as our Quaker book collections, and if you add in the resources for other faiths that our colleagues in the Oriental Museum in Durham hold, you have a wonderful resource here for examining the role and influence of faith in our world, with all this now recognized in our collecting policy, as we are always keen to keep developing our collections to maintain their currency and relevance for research. And at that point, I will hand over to my colleague, Tony.
Thank you very much, Michael. I shall just share my screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about collections care at Durham University and how we preserve our collections. So at Durham University, we seek to preserve our archives and special collections through a range of measures that come under the broad description of collections care. Essentially, these measures are either preservation or conservation. Preservation covers all the actions we take to prolong the lifespan of collection items, stopping short of actually repairing them. Preservation actions can be very large in scale, improving the situation for a whole collection by ensuring they're stored and handled properly, would be an example of that. But also they can be very small in scale. So putting a damaged book in a box will help preserve it, but it will do nothing to address the book's problems. And if a researcher wants to come and actually use that damaged book, we have to apply some remedial conservation treatment. Conservation seeks to improve the condition of collection items through a variety of treatments. And we're fortunate to have an on-site conservation studio at Palace Green Library with professional conservators. During this very brief talk, I'll focus on some of the key preservation measures and look at how they have the biggest impact. Arguably, the single most important factor to get right is the storage of collections. The strong rooms at Palace Green Library were built and are maintained in line with the British standards for the storage of archival materials. But the key principles from these standards should be applied to any storage area, even converted spaces. The main points of these standards include fire protection and detection. So the risk of fire within storage rooms is reduced as much as possible, and the room itself is fire resistant. Early detection and an automated call-out system to the fire brigade are key parts of protecting against the risk of fire. Security. Access to the strong rooms is restricted to certain members of staff. The rooms are locked at all times and all visitors are escorted. Intruder alarms and CCTV are monitored by the university security team. Light levels. So storage areas have no external windows or other sources of light. The overhead lights we have get shut off when staff aren't in the room. The boxes serve to keep light away from the archives. So this is to stop the damaging effects of light, which can be cumulative. So although short durations of high intensity light are very damaging, lower levels of light for a long time can still harm archives. Environmental management. This is really vital and offers the greatest protection against mold and insect infestation. So let's have a closer look at environmental management. Temperature and humidity play a really significant role in preserving archives. And at Durham, we invest a lot of effort into ensuring our collections are stored in appropriate environmental conditions. So looking at these in turn, high temperatures accelerate the rate of deterioration by speeding up chemical reactions taking place within paper, parchment, and leather. Generally, the cooler the better as far as the collections are concerned, but aiming for around 18 degrees centigrade is a happy balance between human comfort and preservation. High humidity is tremendously damaging to archives as damp conditions inevitably lead to mold growth. In a very short space of time, mold can begin to grow on organic archive material. And as it grows, that material becomes weaker, becomes stained, and eventually you can have total loss of material. Pest infestations follow a similar pattern. They thrive in damp, warm conditions and will do catastrophic damage if left unchecked. So the best protection against mold and insects is to carefully monitor temperature and humidity within your storage areas and take steps to keep these conditions at a level where mold and insects will not become established. And these conditions tend to be a humidity above 60% and a temperature below 20. The next thing to get right is packaging. So we aim to have 2 layers of protection between the archive item and the outside world. In most cases, this is a folder within a box. Particularly vulnerable or awkwardly sized objects have their own custom packaging made by our conservators. Now, books aren't routinely boxed unless they're very fragile or require additional support. It's very common that new arrivals, new archive material coming in, has inappropriate packaging for long-term preservation. So often we'll replace that with an archival quality equivalent. Handling fragile archives puts them at risk of damage, but the whole point of preserving them really is to make them accessible to researchers. So handling is an unavoidable risk. It is one that can be mitigated to some extent by ensuring that staff are trained on how to identify vulnerable items and how to properly handle them. And by adopting a standard set of rules for people working with the collections is really fundamental to looking after them. So these are fairly common rules in the world of archives. So things like no food or drink near the archives, clean hands, no pens, all help contribute towards caring for the collection. Finally, a glimpse at some of the remedial conservation work that we carry out. Here is a paper booklet which was severely damaged by prolonged damp conditions. But following cleaning, washing, this was actually washed to remove some of the staining, and paper repair, it's now been returned to a fit state for researchers to access. I hope this extremely brief look at how Durham cares for its archives and special collections has been of interest. There's clearly a lot more to say, so please feel free to get in touch with any other questions. Thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Tony. I'm just going to share my screen if I can. Second. Okay. Okay, my name's Jonathan Bush. I'm archivist at Durham University. I also work at Ushaw College, and this library behind me isn't a fake background. This is actually part of Ushaw College's library. So my role really is I'm mainly involved in the Catholic archivist for the Catholic collections at both Ushaw College and Palace Green Library. And one of those particular collections that I'm working on, and one that I'd like to highlight today, to talk a bit about the sort of cataloguing work that I do on it, is the canonnesses of the Holy Sepulchre archive. Canonnesses have their archive dates back to 1642, and it contains a wide range of different materials. So we've got a printed books library, sort of 595 volumes, extensive music collection, much of which is pre-1800. And the archive itself, which, as I say, dates back to 1642 and goes up principally to the present day. So it's really quite an extensive archive. And thankfully, when it first arrived here back in end of 2018, it came with a very good already described catalogue. This happens to be the sort of main series of where everything is in the archive. So a lot of work was actually done on this before it even arrived here. And the sisters of the Canonnesses of the Holy Sepulchre did a lot of work on it, and they really saw their archive as important. And this is expressed in the amount of work they did on the catalogue. And so when it first arrived, they came in these banker's boxes. And just to sort of reiterate what Tony's been saying, part of my job in cataloguing that is really to put it into archival packaging. So from this sort of before and after, from this to this, so it's acid-free folders and boxes as well. So that's done for pretty much the entire collection. As you can see there, that's a section of it. Thankfully, I do end up putting archive box labels on these things. You don't have to rely on being able to read my wonderful scroll, which is probably just as well. And so this is our kind of back entrance to the cataloging software that we use, which is called XMetal. And this happens to be what's called a collection level description. So this is really a kind of introduction, a summary to the collection, and describes, gives a kind of a very sort of simple introduction to the various components of this collection, including things like the history of the order itself, the contents of the archives, the extent of it, what languages it's in, also just basically everything about the collection at a very top level. And so we put that, we describe that, and this is how it ends up on the university website. So it's hopefully searchable and available for anybody pretty much in the world to look at. So the collection level description is obviously very helpful in terms of starting out, and gives you an idea of really what the collection's like overall. But then in terms of actually describing each individual file, or even in some cases item, we then have to go into a bit more detail. So in this case, this is a file level description, which basically describes every single file in the collection. Sometimes we have to combine them together to say one box rather than one file, but generally for file level is what we tend to prefer. And this is just to give you a kind of go down a bit further. This is a manuscript. It's a manuscript dating from 1652, and how we would describe that in the catalogue, we would obviously put a lot more detail into that than we would do with some of the, say, more modern material. And that's how we would describe it in Ex Metal, which essentially we would describe the type of binding it is, how many pages there are, the measurements, the language, of course, and any provenance information that we can find, because obviously it's quite important to an historian of women religious. And so yeah, so that just gives you a kind of very brief overview of what it is that we actually do, at least in terms of cataloging. And yeah, the end result is that it makes it accessible. Anybody from around the world can search these catalogs and come into Palace Green Library or Ushaw College to view this material in situ. So if anybody has any further questions, then please feel free to contact us. But thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael, Tony, and Jonathan there, talking us through what's been happening at Durham. And just for those of you, because I saw there was a question about hidden histories, that we've seen the Canons of the Holy Sepulchre one talked about there. Because one of the things that we've done at the university is also have researchers working at the same time alongside the archivists and cataloguers to really get behind the collection and to showcase exactly what's there and to see how it can be used. But you'll see from that as well, that's how things have been working at Durham and how we've been looking at. But we're now going to look at something which I suppose in some ways in the UK at the moment we look at with a slight level of envy at the moment, which is what they have managed to start in the Netherlands. And we're going to hear from Susan Scherpenisse from the Heritage Centre for Dutch Monastic Life in the Netherlands. I'm not going to give it its proper Dutch name, that I'm sure Susan will tell us, but about the initiative they have there for looking after these materials and for being in, if you like, homeless collections, for want of a better term at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, James, and also Jonathan from the former presentation for inviting us, the Dutch Heritage Center for Monastic Life, to participate in this conference. It's a pleasure to tell you something about the center, where we preserve archives, objects, and books of different Dutch religious orders and congregations. And I have the honor to work there as one of the archivists. So I will share my screen for the presentation. Well, this is the Heritage Center for Dutch Monastic Life. And I will start this presentation with a brief introduction of the center. And then I will talk about the history of the center itself. And well, especially the archives, as I work there as one of the archivists. Well, so not surprisingly, as it's in its name, the Heritage Center for Dutch Monastic Life is situated in the Netherlands. The first Dutch monasteries have been founded around the year 700. The period between 1100 and 1500 has been referred to as the first golden age of Dutch monastery life. As a consequence of the Reformation, however, most monasteries in the Netherlands had been disappeared by 1600. Just to give some context, the Reformation was a Western movement that initially wanted to improve the Catholic Church and its abuse of power, but eventually resulted in a division. Protestantism became the prominent religion in the Netherlands. Only after 1840, the Dutch King William II granted monasteries permission to hire new members. This resulted in the rise of many new congregations and also many religious sisters, brothers, and fathers working in parishes, education, healthcare, and also in the mission. So from the second half of the 19th century onwards, it became in the Netherlands a sort of century for Catholic emancipation. So this is a map of the Netherlands where the Heritage Center is situated in Sint Agatha. It officially opened its doors in 2006 in a part of an old monastery in the small village of Sint Agatha. Today, over 100 Dutch religious orders and congregations participate in the institution. Most of them already brought their archives, books, and artifacts to the center, in which we also have a professional archival storage vault. The size of the archival collections is currently about 5.5 linear kilometers, varying from 2 meters to 300 meters per archive. The center also preserves about 4,000 objects telling special and representative stories about religious life and more than 30,000 books. Visitors can consult the heritage in a reading room, which I will tell something about later on. And there's also a small exhibition during summer months. So now we'll dive a bit into the history of the Heritage Center, which is a quite unique situation. And it can be traced back to the 1960s. And it can roughly be divided in 3 stages. So the first stage started from the 1960s onwards, when the number of religious vocations in the Netherlands increasingly declined and monasteries had to close. On the one hand, some religious institutes started to collaborate in different projects and organizations. So there was, for example, an alliance for Dutch priest congregations and also an alliance for Dutch sister congregations. On the other hand, development of shrinking vocations and aging members raised concerns about how to secure the heritage of religious orders and congregations. How could the archives of religious orders and congregations be prevented from being destroyed, or perhaps transferred abroad, for example, to a generalate or a mother house? So in the 1980s, a working group for ecclesiastical archives wrote a memorandum in which they plead for a foundation of a service center for religious archives. Brings us to the second stage, because their plea became reality in 1989 when such a service center opened its doors in Nijmegen. The service center was a foundation which employed a number of archivists who assisted the religious archivists in their convents. So it might be a bit similar to what Judith told us earlier. And the archivists also made inventories of complete community archives, digitally registered and repacked in suitable archival materials, as we also saw in an earlier presentation. The service center had been governed by the religious, mostly their superiors. All religious institutes using this service gathered yearly to discuss the state of affairs. Some of them also invested a lot of energy in gaining trust of other religious institutes who had not taken part in the joint foundation of the service center yet, to give the archivists of the center access to their archives. Because archives of religious institutes can be considered as family archives, this was often a very impactful decision. Gradually, the energy of the pioneering religious paid off, and the amount of stakeholders of the service center grew from 18 in 1989 to more than 80 in 2013. Institutionally, the service center was part of the Catholic Documentation Center, which was established by the University of Nijmegen in 1969. The service center and its institutionalization combined 2 goals. First, to secure the history of religious life, work, and also the specific Dutch orders and congregations. And secondly, the contribution of religious sources in a broader social and also cultural history writing of the Netherlands and its colonies. And eventually, this brings us to the third stage, which is the Heritage Center in Sint Agatha, where the archives are today. So around the turn of the century, lack of space for archival materials of orders and congregations proved to be an issue. So in the spring of 2001, the religious of the service center, the religious people who participated in the service center, decided to accommodate their archives, including artifacts, magazines, and books, collectively in an autonomous center. In search of a suitable location in which a center for monastic heritage could be raised, the service center came in contact with the Foundation Sint Aagten of the Canons Regular of the Order of the Holy Cross at Sint Agatha. It's a bit south from Nijmegen, where the university and the Catholic Documentation Center are still today. For the service center, a new foundation had been established, the Foundation Heritage of Dutch Monastic Life. A financial committee estimated the costs of building a modern storage vault in Sint Agatha and of renovating a wing for the existing monastery for today's offices, a reading room, and also some rooms for conferences and a small exhibition. The committee consulted the religious institutes to be assured of the necessary financing. Meanwhile, about 80 Dutch orders and congregations had decided to take part in the project. Their financial contributions, mostly related to the estimated size of their archives, were large enough to guarantee sufficient financial security to realize this project until 2035. Furthermore, a fund has been set up to secure the continuation of the center afterwards. In 2004, a professional climatized archival storage vault had been built, and in 2006, about 60 archival collections moved from Nijmegen to Sint Agatha. In its first years, the activities of the foundation consisted of mapping the heritage, building and structuring a library, archives, and artifacts collections. All movable and immovable goods were carefully registered, their conditions described, and the first preserving activities had been done. So today, the center is governed by a board of both religious and laymen related to or working for the religious institutes, mostly orders and congregations. Already more than 100 and a couple of associated organizations participate in the center, which on the board you can see in one of the photos, their names have been written. So when a new archive arrives, as you can see on another picture, a red pin will be put in the board to show that the archive has been there. And of course, most archives are still living, dynamic archives. So many orders and congregations often bring new additional archival materials. For example, when a convent closes. One of the most recent complete archives arrived last July, the one of the daughters of Maria and Joseph coming from Den Bosch. Since 2006, a small staff and many volunteers have been working on long-term preserving and describing the collections in a professional collection management system. Regarding papers in the archives, for example, plastic will be removed and different files, structures, and described. Every order congregation has its own inventory for archival materials. And with the respect of the often pioneering work of the religious archivists, we try to classify the archives in similar ways. So for example, more general documents such as chronicles, rules, and reports of the General Council can be found in the same section. Moreover, the archives also reflect typical activities for particular details. For example, the first archive I worked on at the Heritage Center was the archive of the Brothers of Heerlen, a small congregation mostly active in the field of healthcare. An interesting detail that resulted in specific archival materials is that one of their first brothers, Brother Aloysius, was very interested in Sebastian Knijp, one of the forefathers of the naturopathic medicine. Furthermore, archives hold photos, and recently we've started to digitize selections of those photos, and also other audiovisual materials such as films, which are being separately stored and also described in catalogs. Then there is a library for which we also set up catalogs. The library holds special older historical publications, for example, manuscripts, and more recent works about religious life and other publications supporting research on Dutch religious life and work. And eventually, the objective of the Heritage Center is not only to structure, preserve, and describe Dutch monastic heritage for the future, but also to make it accessible for a larger public. So therefore, inventories of archival collections and catalogs of the library and objects can be consulted online. This is often the first step for researchers on their way to the reading room of the heritage centers. Researchers can be, for example, academics, genealogical researchers, local historians, students, architects, journalists, writers, or project developers, and of course, the history writers of orders and congregations themselves. They can, for example, be interested in mission history, or they have a family member who attended a school that was run by religious men or women. What makes the Heritage Center being a private archive different from most other archival institutions is that most of its archives are not public. So most of the archives of the orders and congregations, themselves remain owner of their archives. So as a consequence, researchers interested in consulting archival material need their consent. So me and my colleagues, we consult the orders and congregations to guarantee this permission and also take other important issues such as privacy into account. One of the advantages and certainly an added value of the Heritage Center is that it enables researchers to conduct research in different archives at the same time. This could be thematically, for example, by research into different religious sources of inspiration or education in the mission in Indonesia, or developments during the Second World War. In times of completion, the Heritage Center offers a way to safeguard the lived life of many religious sisters, fathers, and brothers in the Netherlands for the future. Well, hopefully this presentation gave you some insight in the history, functioning, and also the value of this special project of the Dutch Heritage Center for Monastic Life. If you have any questions that come up after this presentation, please do not hesitate to send me or my colleagues an email. Thank you for the attention.
So thank you very much for your presentation there, Susan. And what we've seen there, we've seen from Durham, we've seen talking about some of the practicalities and a move going in there, and now a specific body set up to work on these archives. And that's so we've had, if you like, that side of things. And what we're going to do after the break is move to two people working, if you like, in situ. One person with those of a religious congregation and one within a diocesan archive, and to talk about how they go about their practice and about the different challenges that that will bring about with it. There's just one thing I wanted to mention as well that's already become apparent, which I'm sure a lot of you already had in your mind, but we often use archives as a shorthand, but we've already seen that archives don't just mean a bit of paper. It includes a wide range of material, as we've already noted, whether that's books or actual material items and things. But anyway, kicking us off next, the next speaker we have is Patrick Hayes, who is joining us from the Redemptorist Archives, Philadelphia, USA. So Patrick, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'm going to share the screen here. Can you see that all right? Good. Okay, so I'm the archivist for the Eastern and Western Redemptorist provinces in the United States. Since 2018, both provinces, Baltimore and Denver, have their respective collections housed here in Philadelphia. I had been the archivist for the Baltimore province for about 8 years when its collections were housed in Brooklyn, New York. And now in Philadelphia, I've overseen the archive for the last 6 years. I had considerable influence on the planning of the present archive, which moved here in 2015. Suffice to say that I'm very familiar with the collections that I have on site, but with over 1 million documents housed in this archive, I learn something new every day. Let's see if I can advance this. Oh dear. Goodness. This will make more sense if I have the correct slides. So let's see if I can close that out. And share this. So I'm hoping you can see this. And let's advance it. Oh, goodness. Well, let's go to Plan B. My slides are not cooperating. Some of you might be unfamiliar with what a Redemptorist is, so let me start briefly with an overview. It's an order whose formal name is the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, a group of over 5,000 confreres working in 76 countries around the world. On the model of their founder, St. Alphonsus Liguori, they consider themselves global missionaries to the most abandoned. St. Alphonsus, as you might know, is the patron of confessors and moral theologians and is a doctor of the church. His order was founded in 1732 in Scala, Italy, along the Amalfi Coast. After decades of political intrigue, a group branched off to Vienna and eventually sent 6 men to North America just about a century after the founding in July of 1832. In the UK and Ireland, you might know these folks in the south of London at St. Mary's in Clapham or at Bishop Eaton in Liverpool. They run a retreat house in the city of Perth in Scotland. In Ireland, they're rather famous in Dundalk, in Belfast, at Clonard, at Mount St. Alphonsus in Limerick and Esker in County Galway, but they have missions all over the world. In the latter half of the 19th century, the Redemptorist reputation in the United States was cemented by their abilities in the pulpit, and after 1868, the promotion of the devotion to Our Lady of Perpetual Help, whose icon is now the most reproduced image of the Virgin and Child on the planet. The 19th and early 20th century is also marked by their pastoral care of German-speaking Catholic communities, both in the US and Canada, but quickly spread to Italian and Spanish-speaking communities in the 20th century. Their lives and ministries form the core of our collections, which result in numerous research requests each year. I get about 130 to 150 requests. When the Western Denver province joined the Baltimore collections in 2018, the expectation was to unify the Redemptorist story in the United States, but as the units shrink and pastoral needs and responsibilities shift, we're increasingly global in outlook. So for example, the North American Conference, which is the amalgamation of all of the provinces in North America, they're seeking ways to create more collaborative ventures, and this archive tracks all of that work. Additionally, next year, the novitiate for all of the Redemptorist students in North America will be moving to a new community outside of Mexico City. So I need to practice my Spanish if I'm going to keep pace with that. I'm a former college professor in religious studies, and so I have an inkling of what researchers are up against in their own research. And so I try to make this archive especially accessible to them. This archive, I will admit, is the product of a significant capital outlay on the part of the Redemptorists. I'm talking millions of dollars. And the commitment shows a recognition on their part that their heritage materials matter and that they have research value. It's also an acknowledgement that their numbers are declining and that their materials are worth preserving. So much for preliminaries. I can tell you that the archives collection policy is very broad, but I try to accession materials that will assist researchers in their scholarship, fill in gaps in our own collections, or somehow support existing collections. We consider heritage materials mainly, though not exclusively, the documentary record of Redemptorist life and ministry in the United States and its various missions. Since about the 1840s, there's been a concerted effort to preserve documents that now total well over 1 million individual items. A specialized research library of about 25,000 volumes supports the collections. The Redemptorists began to spawn new missions in the Caribbean beginning in 1858, when the Belgian-born Father Louis Dold, coming from America, set foot on the island of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands and took possession of the local parish. Their mission spread to the island of Puerto Rico in 1902 in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. As part of the vice province of San Juan, they began work in the Dominican Republic and other islands. The Baltimore province eventually sent men to Brazil and to Paraguay, and these became vice provinces and then autonomous units. The heritage material supply an abundant, and I would argue an important contribution to the history of the Catholic Church in the United States from the late 18th century to the present. There are individual papers of bishops, some of which supplement or surpass the documentation found in diocesan archives. Paridi, who attended the Second Vatican Council, so for example, Francis Cannell, T. William Coyle, or Francis X. Murphy are housed here, as well as manuscript and recordings of Bernard Herring. He frequently toured through the United States giving talks. And in any case, his texts are here and not found elsewhere in Europe. Perhaps the crown jewels of our collections are the house annals from every Redemptorist foundation in America. And since these individuals were in every major American city, they're great for local history. They supply kind of granular information on Redemptorists in a particular locale, coincident by date, and frequently give context for notable public events or personages. We also have our share of unusual materials not ordinarily associated with the Redemptorists. For instance, we have one of the largest collections on the Shroud of Turin in North America. It was begun by an American Redemptorist student in Rome, Father Edward Winchell, in the 19-teens. He could not come home for holiday back in those days, and so a classmate invited him to his hometown of Turin. And naturally, they visited the cathedral, and Winchell became a lifelong devotee of the Shroud. Eventually, his fascination grew into worldwide expertise, and he assembled a significant library on the Shroud with many unique items. And this collection continues to grow even after 100 years since its beginning. While there are lots of aspects of the collections that are deserving of mention, I'll highlight a couple of broad areas that I think encompass multiple research programs. First, we have what might be called bridge material between Redemptorists of Europe and those on the American mission, extending from the beginning of the 1830s to about the 1920s. The notion of mission itself shifted, and orders such as the Redemptorists responded in kind. American Redemptorists were no longer solely accompanying immigrant populations, but fostering new ways of having a missionary outlook. Thus, the immigrant experience of the long 19th century has deep resonance in our collections. Secondly, there is significant data in so-called ethnic parishes that tried to keep language and cultural mores intact between generations. There is a considerable stock of material on their devotional lives and the parishes they built to support them. Insofar as these enclaves were developed in urban environments, the built landscape shows strong evidence of Catholic influence. Our image collections supply a plethora of visible examples, but our property records also tell a story about the reception of Catholics in cities and towns across the country. Finally, anyone doing a sociological or anthropological study of popular interactions with Redemptorists will find resources for their project. Redemptorists were often seen as kitchen priests because they were so familiar to local families. They came into contact with a wide swath of the American population, such as the urban poor, those with hearing loss, migrants and refugees, African Americans, and so on. Our clientele varies, but I like to think that the archive exists to help further scholarship and to give new insights into American and Catholic culture. I'm happy to say that dozens of books and scholarly articles have emerged through the use of the Redemptorist archives. And some recent books, I could mention Kathleen Cummings, A Saint of Our Own, is one example of great use of our collections that emerged as a book. When I can, I also try to produce some scholarly work. I do some book chapters or journal essays every now and then, but our principal means of promoting Redemptorist history is through our biannual bulletin, which I edit. I've also had an opportunity to curate a museum for the Shrine of St. John Newman, which is located across the street from my office. I'm actually working on a film to support the shrine. I also run the Facebook and Instagram accounts. So there's a lot that's happening here. One of the reasons that my whiskers are so white is because I have a lot to do. I try not only to catalog the material that comes into the archive and so provide for intellectual control for some future archivist, I also show up and document people and events around the province. So I'm kind of the province historian. Wherever I go, my camera goes with me. I try to document as much as possible. Additionally, working near this shrine of St. John Newman offers a unique glimpse into Catholic life in America, in part because it's a pilgrimage site and everyone, and I mean everyone, comes from all over the world to be at this place. So we've even had a visit from Pope John Paul II back in 1979, but also all manner of celebrities and other saints. The recent COVID pandemic has put a damper on everyone's plans for public programming. But next month, I'm hoping that our archive can be open again to the public. I'm going to have an open house and a film screening later that evening. And if only you could see my beautiful exhibit room and my slides worked, I'm sure you'd be impressed. I've mentioned that I work on social media for the archive, but it's really to support the Redemptorist brand. We have lots and lots of interesting things in the archive. There's no shortage of material to post on social media. It's something that the archives in the United States try to do with greater frequency when they have the time. And I want to close with a simple note of thanks to my collaborators, both in the city of Philadelphia and across the country. I have great resources here in the Philadelphia area. The archival community is wonderful. We all help one another out. diocesan archives across the country have been most helpful to me, and I try to give as much as I get. I want to try and impress upon you the importance of what American archives can do for Europeans. In many ways, you have led, especially in the amalgamation of several different archives of religious institutes that have come to completion. We're learning from you. But I will say we also have helped set the pace for a number of different religious archives in this country. I'm sure we can learn from one another in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for that, and for highlighting the very necessary need for collaboration throughout all of this and for what we're doing. Also, as well, just when we're talking about the different types of archive, for mentioning as well, of course, the photographic archive and things like that, and images that we haven't touched upon so much, but their importance, and also that engagement side of things. I'd also just like to mention as well that it's probably a question a few of you have that Patrick's brought on there, that for all you might have what is in nature a discrete archive, i.e. this is the Redemptorist one, but actually it's disparate in content. It doesn't just mean that it's only of interest for Redemptorists or those interested in Redemptorists, a much wider interest there that can be found. But moving on to our final speaker today, I'm delighted to hand over to Noel Dowling from the Archdiocese of Dublin in Ireland. Noel.
Thank you. Right, I suppose I'm going to speak about my own archive, but I'm also going to speak about church archives in Ireland in a general way as well, because I think our experiences might shock you a little bit as well today. So this is going to be very different, okay? I just want to say thanks to Judith for the initial invitation to speak today, and to everybody involved in the organisation. It's been fab. There is amazing work going on. I'm so proud of everything we all do. I've worked in the diocesan archives for the past 16 years. 10 years before that, or for 10 years, I worked with the Christian Brothers. I've also had the great privilege, I suppose, of managing and looking after the collection of a female religious enclosed order in my spare time. And I have worked with many bishops throughout Ireland in advising them about their archive collections. So I suppose if you, those of you who don't know the diocesan archives, the diocesan archives is the largest Catholic archives in the island of Ireland. In reality, it is the most important archive outside of the National Archives. It has material relating to the development and evolution of the diocese from 1400 up to the present day. There's lots of information on the mission of the church in Dublin, including correspondence with various religious congregations and dioceses scattered throughout Ireland and abroad. And it is also a very significant collection of material relating to the social and political history of Ireland. And this is probably why it's of particular relevance in the study of Irish history. Dublin is the capital city. The government is located here, and hence the Archbishop of Dublin has always had a lot of power and influence. For many ordinary people, they trusted the church more than they trusted the state, and that interaction is actually recorded in the archives today. However, over the past 20 years, that trust has been eroded. Debate today questions the power of the church in Ireland, the role it played in all aspects of people's lives, and the publicity about the church and its past has not been complimentary. And in reality, this is having an impact on the world of church archives, as most ordinary people only know what they hear or read through the media. The commentary in the press about church archives implies that the collections are not cared for properly, that there is limited access to surviving collections, and that there appears to be no accountability or transparency, and a disregard for laws that impact the world of archives. But I'll mention that again later. The Dublin Diocesan Archives has been very good at recording its past, I suppose, especially as most of its records are paper-based. You know, it is letters, it is photographs, and we do have a mishmash of other material as well. We've had a permanent home for the Diocesan Archives since the building of Archbishop's House in 1890. So it's been very easy to keep and manage and store records. But I'm not really sure how the future is going to look in terms of the long-term preservation of our digital records. The Diocesan Archives has not gone, or the diocese has not gone fully digital, but we are doing more and more work in that sphere. And it's really difficult sometimes to get the point across to people on a daily basis that what they're working on today is the story of the church at this moment in time, a critical moment, and those records need to be captured for the future as well. As we know as well, for many researchers today, if you don't find us on Google, then we don't actually exist. And many church archivists are not technological experts, and they don't have expertise around that area or around the area of social media. I am a technological dinosaur, right? It's as simple as that. But I marvel at my colleagues, and I am so willing to learn, you know, with their engagement with social media and everything. And there are some wonderful websites in Ireland, churcharchives.ie, which is the Association for Church Archives website, and catholicarchives.ie, which is a recent addition to the sphere, where we've a lot of religious congregations beginning to put up some collections online as well. And people like the Capuchins and Dr. Brian Kirby and their presence on social media, they have such a wonderful following. You know, they're doing amazing, amazing work. And I'm glad Patrick mentioned the pandemic, because up to the pandemic, we were open 5 days a week, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. It was absolutely wonderful. And we closed in March 2020, and we've only actually reopened in the past 3 weeks. During the pandemic, I was very lucky because I could come into the office and I facilitated research as much as I could. I have scanned and emailed hundreds, if not thousands, of documents for people. It has been brilliant. But during the first lockdown, as we know, lots of people began to make banana bread. During the second lockdown, people decided to do family history, right? So I have learned so much about family history. And the one thing, I'm never going to do my own family history. I'm just telling you now, it's oh my God. But anyway, that's a whole other story. The people who suffered most are those who need to have access to lots and lots of material, because I couldn't facilitate that research. And many of their theses and everything have finished. The books have been written without hearing our voice. They have lost out in so many sources, and that's actually really, really sad. And just in terms of archives, and getting back to an earlier point, where we're accused of being secretive and hiding material and obstructing everything, it's not actually the case. You know, sort of people assume that we have certain records, but the reality is we don't. You know, there's lots of things that are created nowadays that weren't created 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or whatever. But, you know, people don't believe you. And you know, but my question, and it is rhetorical, is why would I waste anybody's time, you know, hiding material from them? It's going to be yes or no. If we can't give you material, there's probably a legal reason for it, more than likely data protection, you know, sort of, but we will explain that to people and all the rest of it. But like, I suppose, a lot of places, we're taking in different collections as well. We get people who, you know, are donating material because their grandmother has died, and it might even be things like simple prayer books or, you know, sort of photographs because they were involved in a choir. But we also take in, you know, sort of big collections. We take in some of the standing committees from the Episcopal Conference. We take in papers. We have the ecumenical group, the Dublin Council of Churches. This is the repository for them. And of course, we've had the big events in the last 10 years. We've had the Eucharistic Congress in 2012 in Dublin, and we had the World Meeting of Families in 2018. So those collections are now part and parcel of what we have here in the archives as well. And we have researchers coming from all over the world, because our Dublin bishops, I suppose, were very instrumental in appointing bishops in the English-speaking colonies, as well as, you know, getting missionaries to go to different places. And we have a lot of material around that here. In 2019, pre-pandemic, we hit over 2,000 research inquiries in a year. And when I started here 16 years ago, there was 300. So this is a very big archive. It's a very busy archive. There's a huge interest in the study of church history. And I think that needs to be remembered and promoted as well. I'm the only person who works here. It's as simple as that. I have one volunteer who is a retired priest and another who's a retired teacher. I would be lost without them. It's as simple as that. Our biggest issue at this moment in time is the building I'm sitting in right now. I'm actually sitting in our reading room. Our building has been sold. They're going to be building apartments and here very, very shortly. My collection has over 20,000 boxes of archival material. We have to plan for maybe 30 to 50 years in the future. And we've also to take into consideration parishes beginning to group together, or churches closing, and the possibility that those parish registers and all of their, material will be coming to the archives. And like Patrick again, I've suddenly become the expert in the art around the college and finding homes for it, in, the diocesan library, investments in kind of all sorts of plate and chalices and drum kits. There are lots of drum kits around Clonliffe, I'll just tell you that as well. So there's an awful lot to be done. Time is ticking. We literally have to be out of here by October of next year. We have looked at so many buildings, we literally can't find the space big enough. So it's actually really stressful, because you can't prepare a new building, but I can't prepare any material for leaving either. I know that for all archives, we will always complain that we don't get enough investment, and that actually is the case. But in terms of our voice here, and I'm talking about my own archives, our collections are open up to 1972. But if we look at our counterparts in the National Archives, they follow a 30-year rule. So anything that they are writing about in terms of social history, politics, anything like that, there is no church voice. Our collections aren't available. Therefore, you can say anything in one sense, and in the other sense, sort of like we can't back anything up because our collections just aren't available yet. The archivist is the heart of the archives. They just absolutely are. And, Judith's definition at the start was just spot on. Archivists know the collections. They obviously know their subject. They're the voice and the champion of the archives. Things like data protection in my world, I know some of you have to deal with freedom of information, but the world of compliance, governance, they're now a daily headache for archivists. But without the help of the archivist, no researcher is actually going to find their way through the collections, no matter how good the catalogues are, because you can be having a conversation with somebody about something and they mention something else and it triggers about 900 different things. So you're all the time kind of saying, oh, you need to look at this and you need to look at that. So that's really, really important. And you need the archivist working on the records of today so that there is an actual archive of tomorrow. I think working in archives, in church archives in Ireland at the minute, you need to be a bit thick-skinned, and you need to be a warrior. You have to champion the archives both within your organisation, but you're also defending them, in the public domain. And I'm not even going to talk about the online abuse that, is a regular occurrence now. It's almost a daily feature, this sort of way. I now don't open them until after I have my coffee in the morning. The future, I think there needs to be lots of collaboration, and I'm so glad, to hear about what's happening in the Netherlands and what an amazing thing that's happening in Durham. You're doing incredible work. I wish we were doing something like that in Ireland. In here, I suppose the latest, I suppose, in the media is that, church archives in Ireland should be handed over to the state so that better access would be given to the records. My statement in relation to that is the state doesn't have enough resources to fulfill their own obligations, not to mind taking on our problems. But the media keep promoting this along with some archivists and historians, and it's something that keeps coming up every now and again, especially after the numerous state inquiries we've had into sexual abuse over the last number of years. our church archives have invested an awful lot of money, congregations, dioceses, in buildings, in hiring professional archives, in creating catalogues and making things available. So I think that, you know, the comments that are being made are really, really unfair. And it's, you know, sort of, and I do think we need to kind of start trying to address that as well. And a lot of the people who are making these claims have never actually been inside the door of a church archive. The records that I suppose are generating a lot of publicity at the minute are those relating to the Mother and Baby Home Commission. You know, but a lot of those records, you know, that people are looking for were actually handed over to the state agency, TUSLA. It's the Child and Family Agency. So we don't have them. It's as simple as that. The congregations don't have them. There's also the impression that if you were baptized in the Catholic Church, somehow we have like this mammoth file on you. It's again not a reality. We don't, you know, and people accuse us all the time of using the information from baptismal registers to bump up the statistics, you know, sort of how many Catholics are in the country, where in fact that information you fill out yourself in the census form, and that's where it comes from. And whether we like it or not, data protection is having a huge impact on our life. It is restricting what we do, but it's not stopping us what we do. There are ways and means around it, but I do think a lot of people are misusing it, both archivists and the outside world. Diocesan archives can often be overlooked by people doing research into congregations, you know, sort of, but if you take the time to trawl, you will find gold dust in there. The collections are so rich and varied. You know, they talk about so much. I think one of the problems in Ireland is that so few diocesan archives are open. Any of those that are mainly in metropolitan areas. So we're not getting a glimpse of what's happening in the more rural, smaller dioceses. But the bishops are employing archivists. They're opening up their collections, you know, sort of. So even if you can't find, you know, contact details, make contact with the actual local bishop and see what he has to say. His archives mightn't be out there, but you'd be surprised what's there. I think there's great opportunities for the future. I do think we need to work much more closely with historians and with our researchers. I think we have to be able to bounce off that negativity. But, you know, the church has been around for 2000 plus years. Our story is there. It's a very important message. Let's keep getting it out there. But I would love if people would just start collaborating more together in Ireland and start working on, you know, get over the fear, you know, that sort of way, you know, sort of, if the truth is out there, you know, that's very, very important. You know, that's all people are looking for is the truth. And I want to commend people like the Sisters of Mercy and the work that's been done by Cormac Begadon and the Franciscan Sisters of the Divine Motherhood and the work that's been done by Brian Casey. And that's the kind of research that should be happening in Ireland as well. I'm going to end with just a quote from Pope St. Paul VI to ecclesiastical archivists. And this was from 1963. And I think this sums up what archives are all about. It is Christ who acts in history and who writes his own history, so that our records are echoes and traces of his passing through the world. And so to have respect for these records, documents and archives ultimately means to have respect for Christ, to have a sense of the church, and to provide ourselves and those who will come after us with the history of this period of the Lord's passing through the world. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much for that, Noelle. And I know addressing head on there, I know quite a few concerns that especially those looking after archives for religious congregations have, and about the perceptions people might have on them, which we might come to in some of the questions and the discussion that we're going to have now. So we're going to move into that question and discussion stage. What I'm going to do is try and group some of the questions together. We're going to start with some of the practical questions, and then perhaps come to some of the broader ones that are perhaps more conceptual. I would say, because you've got questions, please do continue to add them to the chat function. It's not now shut in any way, shape or form. But the first question I want to ask, I'm going to give Noel a little rest just for now on this one, because it's a practical one about systems that are used for cataloguing. I'm going to ask Jonathan and Patrick as well. So we've got ones from different areas to just ask about it. And so we've got Sister Virginia Young asked, how does X-Metal Catalogue connect to the university website, Jonathan? We have Christine Hughes asking which cataloging system you use, and Paul O'Brien is also asking the same and asking what is X-Metal as well. So I'm going to ask Jonathan first, and Patrick, you might like to say as well what systems you're using in the US, so we can get a feel for it.
Okay, thank you. It's a strange one, this one, because I come at it from an archivist rather than an IT point of view. So I'm not going to pretend that I know the full answer to your question. But what my understanding is that X-Metal uses a language called XML, which is a sort of which can then be which the computer itself, the internet, can actually read. So it uses what's called encoded description, and it encodes things into tags, which makes it searchable, and means that that it can be read on the computer. But that's kind of about as far as I know, I'm afraid. But there are different systems, and X-Metal is the one that university uses. The CALM is another one, which I think has been mentioned in the questions as well. And but they do use different ways of cataloging archives, but ultimately the same result is that it is made available on the web, and they can be searched on the web.
And then Jonathan, just before Patrick jumps in, just whilst we're on you, and then we'll move to Patrick. So we're not going. It's just about how that all works in conjunction with the university. So I think someone's asking that if you add a catalogue into the university system, for example.
So so we add catalogues into the back end of X-Metal, and then it basically gets uploaded onto our website, and becomes a sort of web page, which people can actually search through our website. So it's as simple as that, really, in terms of it's basically a kind of almost like a web page which is uploaded, and then can be searched.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So Patrick, I'm going to hand over to you, and I'm going to add on one question that's just come in from Father Patrick as well, asking if you've used Atom and is it any good for Catholic archives or not. And we'll go Patrick, and then Noel, I don't know if you want to jump in after Patrick as well. So we've got voices from all different areas.
Sure. At the present moment, we don't use any cataloging system other than Excel spreadsheets, which is not optimal. Prior to the global pandemic, we were just about to ink a contract with a company called Lucidia, which had the basic intention of supplying us with a platform to catalog our research library, so about 25,000 volumes. And from that, we were going to build on to start documenting and cataloging our paper collections. They have functionality in that respect. The telescoping effect of that contract would have been first the library, then the archival documentation, objects, artwork, vestments and textiles, and so on. It's very difficult to find a company in the United States that's affordable where you can do all of that in one fell swoop. And since many religious archives across the country, including this one, have different media to try and go to a one-stop shop, it's next to impossible without spending a great deal of money. Lucidia is still on the back burner. The pandemic tapped the brakes on that project, but we expect to do that this coming year. As far as Atom goes, I do know some archivists who've used that to great effect. It has wonderful features for the cataloging of artwork. And as in terms of X-Metal and the technicalities of that, I think Jonathan has said it all. I'm handicapped. I went to divinity school, so I don't know anything about that stuff.
Thank you, Patrick. Noelle, do you want to add anything?
Well, like Patrick, I'm afraid we're kind of the poor relations when it comes to software. I mean, we use Microsoft kind of as well in their products. So be it Excel, we use Access Database for photographs and a lot of Word for cataloging as well. But we are actually moving into using Atom. I just have to sit down and, you know, kind of get more proficient in it. I've made one foray. It was a disaster, you know, sort of, but, you know, sort of, it is very good. There's a number of religious archives in Ireland now using it. The Jesuits, the Capuchins, the Passionists, I think, Glenstall, the Smeatons, you know, and, you know, sort of CatholicArchives.ie has quite a number of, you know, sort of like, you know, these congregations coming together under the one domain and doing this. So yeah, it looks like Atom will be the way some of us will be going for the near future.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I'm going to roll that question over to Susan as well. Okay, and Susan, not just to talk about the collection, I'm also going to ask you a distinct one that someone's asked if you could just comment on the funding of the initiative in the Netherlands, and do individual congregations continue to pay for professional upkeep of their archives? That's questions from David. So if you'd be all right, please, addressing both of them. Thank you.
Yes, so well, first about the funding, that's, well, I can explain something about it, but if you have more specific questions, it might be better to send an email. But in general, the orders and congregations of whom we preserve the archives contribute per linear meter. So it depends on the size of their archives. And also when the archives are being transferred to the Heritage Center, we make an indication of how much time it costs to, well, to repack, for example, the archives, remove plastics, and also to converse the inventories to our collection management system, which, well, refers to the first question. And yeah, we use MyFlexes, but I'm not sure if it's only a Dutch system which is used in well, in different archives or not. And furthermore, about the funding, so today we try to set up a fund to secure the center after 2035, but that development is still going on. So yeah, we also have to look for, probably have to look for different ways in the future as well. So I hope this answers a bit of the question.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. I'd just say as well that we just had in the chat that Jonathan has just added a link that you can look to there for further information about cataloguing software, and also from Donna Maguire, who's involved the Scottish Catholic Archives, about a system using Calm that's being used. I see we've just got another one. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on this before I leave this question. I'm going to move to Tony in a second, but also Lisa said she's coming looking into expects as a potential cataloguing software for the archive, and they'll allow a demo to try. I just wonder if any of you have used that as well before I leave the archiving software question behind. I'll take that stunned silence as none of you have used that. None of you have used that one yet. Okay, we'll go now to Tony. If I could ask you a question from Rupert Otten, and this one is branching us out into, if you like, the non-archival, well, it's still part of the collections, but how do you store historic vestments? And are there any special considerations that you need to make when dealing with these sorts of materials? And we might even go from historic vestments to perhaps other items that you might want to mention there as well, Tony, in your response.
Sure. When it comes to vestments and textiles, packaging is always quite difficult. So there's two approaches. The ideal, but not very practical, is to store everything flat. So ideally, you'd have some lovely big boxes, lay the vestments in it, and you would put padding to stop any creases or folds forming. That's fantastic, but space is a real issue. So something's very fragile, we may package it in that manner. But for the majority of vestments, assuming they're strong enough to support their own weight, we would actually hang those. So we would get some broad wooden coat hangers, effectively, and pad those out with an archival sort of foam-based padding, and basically shape that padding to best fit and support the vestment. And then we would hang it in a bag. So we'd make an enclosure out of a suitable material to keep the light off it and any dust away from it as well. Probably the biggest concern is the environmental conditions, really. So you wouldn't want to be storing vestments in an environment that's very damp because of the potential for insects to start eating them effectively. Moth infestation would be a concern. So we would be inspecting those quite regularly, particularly around spring, summer, making sure that nothing's emerging and looking for debris or any signs of infestation occurring. Yes, so textiles ideally flat, but hanging tends to be a better option. Other archive materials that are problematic, I think we've touched upon photographic collections, which are fantastic, but early photographs have a lot of problems because of their chemical makeup and the materials used for them. So early plastics can degrade very dramatically. So we might be looking at potentially isolating those from other archives, packaging them a little bit differently, and looking at different ways of storing those. So if you're coming across plastic negatives, for instance, which are degrading rapidly, there's not a huge amount that can be done to stop that process, and we'd be looking at digitizing those as a priority. And if facilities allow, storing those below 0 degrees, so freezing them to stop or at least slow down the chemical degradation.
Okay, thank you for that, Tony. We're still getting a few questions about the archivists, about how to, if you like, which cataloguing systems to use. I might leave them till the end. We might come back to that again, just so we can just go to a couple of other broader questions. And this is one I'd like to actually bring in Judith and Michael, because I know that both of them are aware of some of the issues around this. And that was a question from Joop van Gennep, who asked a question about congregations when they reach completion, that sometimes some send their materials to Rome, whilst others look to keep it in the country of origin. He's saying obviously that would be a preference from researchers' side of you. But I want to bring in particular Judith and Michael just to talk about some of those issues, but to also talk about some of the legal issues around that, because I know there's very set legal things that have to be gone through in the UK about people who are looking at moving archives or removing them from the country. So if Judith and Mike, I could hand that over to you for discussion, please.
Yes, we have taken in material. Well, in fact, we're talking to a generalate about taking in their archive at the moment, and that is an issue certainly that we would discuss with the community. I'm not sure from our point of view there's a particular right or wrong. We will try and comply with the organization's particular wishes, and I would emphasize that that is our approach throughout, is to try and yes, accommodate what might be the wishes of the community for the future of their collection. Otherwise, we have taken in yes, provincial archives for this country. So those would include material from other institutions around the country. It's always a question as to how local you keep material, or whether that it should all be aggregated in one place. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer on that. And I think it's very much a case for looking at each community in turn on that. I'm not sure if Judith would be able to elaborate on that at all.
Oh, hello, Judith, you're muted just for a second.
Yes, it is an issue, particularly as the questioner, I think, implied, when collections might be moved out of the country of their origin. As I mentioned in my introduction, the archives ultimately, we feel, become the property of the whole of the community, not just the organisation that creates them, but they relate so intimately to the community where that organisation might have worked. So, for example, with a community of religious sisters who might have run schools or hospitals or visited the sick, any religious community interacts with the wider community in which it works and lives. And so the information that is held in the archives is important to those people, as well as to the creating community, as well as down the line to historical researchers. And that would be the bottom line for me. It's not just a case, I think we have to look at it two ways. It also comes up in the case of missionary orders and communities. One example that I discussed a while back with somebody working as an archivist in South Africa is the concern that a lot of the archives created in South Africa by religious communities are then taken back to the Generalate. So they might be in England or Holland or France or somewhere. And the communities in South Africa are very conscious that this information relating to their development and their growth has been removed from them. So it works both ways. I do know of examples, one in Great Britain, where a community was closing a house and taking the material out of the country, in fact, to Italy, and where, with cooperation with local people, the whole collection was digitized so that a copy remains in the community. And obviously that to me would be the ideal, but that may depend on the size of the collections and so on. It might not be easily possible, but that is something that one would aim for. And that is the sort of thing that might be imposed by a government department that monitors export of archives, because in Europe, and I haven't checked up as to whether the regulations have changed significantly since Britain left the European Union, but there are very detailed regulations about what could be removed, and export licenses and so on have to be obtained. And I would imagine that every country has that, which is another dimension of an interaction with the civil law. I have for some time been trying to put something together about this, haven't finished yet. Things keep changing, but it is the sort of thing that Catholic Archives Society has been thinking about, and we hope that before too long we might be able to produce some basic guidance about the legislation and so on in the form of one of our advice leaflets, but also considering the issues that I raised in my introduction about the interaction between these religious communities, the communities in which they live and work, as well as obviously the needs of people who are doing serious research other than just as well as family history or community history. It's quite a serious issue. Okay.
Thank you, Judith, for that. Now I've deliberately got you all on the screen because I want to ask one last question, and this is one that you might all want to pipe up on, because I think I've interpreted this correctly from Chris Dychek, who's asked about the range of views of archives of those visiting them, and about how you deal with perceptions. And so it might be what visitors find useful, or if they think perhaps that if it's a community looking after them, they're not aware of how useful they are or their potential, and how you deal with those conflicting views. Perhaps I just say here, as the non-archivist here, as the historian, is I think everything in the archives is useful, and I'd keep everything, which I know is a mantra that I'm sure upsets all the archivists happily there. But what I would say, certainly from a historian's point of view, is that, you know, what sometimes some people will think it can be quite a dull record actually can reveal a huge amount. So I say, just from my point of view, to always remember that. But I want to throw that over for the archivist to how you deal with those perceptions.
Well, perhaps if I might start then, if no one else wants to jump in, and to say that, yes, and this is a point I was sort of thinking of elaborating on a bit when Judith was speaking, and coming from particularly, shall we say, a non-Catholic organization, Durham University, we look at the collections, all the collections even that we take in, try and look at them from a sort of as wide a view as possible, in that they can be of significance to any possible research angle. With the Catholic collections, it doesn't necessarily need to be a particular Catholic angle. I think, as certainly Judith and others have mentioned, the fact that these communities are within a local community, there may be people in that local community who are interested in, I don't know, the local tradespeople operating with the Catholic community, and the fact that it's the Catholic community is perhaps not quite so relevant to them as the fact that it's, you know, the local butcher or the local candlestick maker or whatever who's doing work with that organization. So we try and view these in the sort of the biggest round possible, as it were, from the point of view of access from people. And we're delighted when people come at these collections from a completely sort of different tangent, as it were. Researchers are always surprising us, James.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for being nice about research. I would just add as well, of course, that one of my ones, before I asked someone else who got a response, is I was talking to Jonathan only recently, and someone using the archives of the English College at Lisbon held at Ushaw. So clearly, you know, the archives of a seminary, effectively a college, and they were looking at the wine trade, and they were able to find all sorts of material on that just in there. So that just gives you an idea of actually how much material, important material, for a much broader spectrum than perhaps some might initially assume is available there. Jonathan?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to say that we also had a researcher looking in the Lisbon collection on the subject of ear trumpets, 18th century ear trumpets. So you can get anything, really.
So does anyone else just want to comment about perceptions? I'm looking to at Susan, Patrick and Noel, if you've got anything you want to add there.
When people step into my archive, their first impression is, oh my goodness, I'm in a Dickens novel. This is an old curiosity shop. There is more order to it than that, but it's an easy impression to come by.
I always marvel when people come to the diocesan archive, and especially if they've had no connection with the church, because they automatically assume you're a religious sister. But with a name like Noel, some people think I'm Noel, so I'm father, you know, this sort of way. So there can be lots of surprises, but I've had people hand me their passports when they literally step through the door. I've had people who look like they think they should genuflect. You know, it's very different, and it takes a while for people to realize, you know, sort of that, I suppose, well, where my level of normal is the only way I can describe it, you know, sort of, but people are made feel very welcome. But like that, what I love is, you know, when, you know, various different people cataloging have different things, you know, over the years and all the rest of it. And as Jonathan says, you know, this sort of way, you never know. You look at a document and you see one thing, and somebody else might pick out one sentence or whatever that really is the crux of what it is they're looking for. And we get many researchers and they'd say, I'm looking, and I'm there, oh, I don't really know if we have anything, but come in, visit or whatever, and suddenly you realize you have a whole tranche of material on the Falkland Islands or something like that that you never knew you had, because it was how the catalogues were done many years ago. We have a huge amount of information, things like art history and the collection of art, but whoever was cataloguing the papers at the time had no interest in art, so there's no mention of it. So, you know, so there's lots of things that you can redo. And yeah, we've loads of stuff on wine as well. It's great.
Yeah, we also have sometimes artists coming to the reading room just to use the archives in a way. Well, I think I would have never imagined that would have been possible. That's certainly surprising. And I think it is a really difficult question what to preserve and what not. And sometimes, well, if, for example, there's no relation with to the congregation and the archival material, well, then it's sometimes might be better just not to preserve it, I think. Makes the collection, the things that remain stronger. So yeah, as a starting point, we to discuss questions if materials have to be preserved or not, we often look at, well, what does it say about the religious life and its members and their activities? So yeah, in a broad way, that is the starting point. And for the public, I was, for example, surprised that also anthropologists, for example, so apart to artists, when they visit the archives, it's really surprising what they find. So that can add something.
Thank you, Susan. I think there, combined all of you as well, you've burst the myth that archivists are just hoarders who found a profession that they can go into, which I think is definitely a myth that exists, and I'm sure you've all experienced that before. We've just gone over by almost 10 minutes, but I don't think that's bad. So to just start wrapping things up here, and it's first is just reiterate what everybody here has spoken about, and what I would say again is please do email us if you've got any questions about caring for your archive, about how you go about it, or about the future of the archive, or about research and encouraging research and so on, how to deal with researchers, then please do contact us. As I said, that's a genuine message. It's not just a lip service one. So please do that. I would like to thank all of you for coming. It's been great to see. I've noticed in the chat function people from all over the world, and so we really do welcome you. It's great to see that you know this is of interest and that people are interested in it and want to discuss it and learn about it. I would also like to thank Brian Casey, who's been doing the admin side of this, who's invisible, but he is there and has been working away strong on it, and to thank him for that. And finally, to thank all of our speakers for giving us the time today, but also from my point of view as a researcher, for putting the time in with all that you do, because you are right, and you probably don't always get the credit that you deserve, but actually you're hugely, hugely necessary if any research is going to take place. So you can also all remember I've been really nice to you there for when I next asked to come to the archive. But Jenny, thank you very much for your contributions and taking the time to be with us today. Thank you. Goodbye.